Welcome back to the Lights Out podcast, bedtime stories for boys and girls, for when the lights go out. Good evening, boys and girls. Are you ready for bed? Are you all wrapped up nice and warm and ready for another Lights Out bedtime story? Well, you're in for a treat tonight, because tonight's story is part 13 of the Twits by the one and only Roald Dahl. And tonight's story is called Mr. Twit Gets a Horrid Shock. And a big shout out goes to all the awesome authors who are supporting the ad-free forever 1,000 stories for boys and girls around the world, and the listeners who are clicking subscribe on all the platforms. You know where it is, and so that you get notified on Spotify for the next story, which will be part 14, and it's called The House, the Tree, and the Monkey Cage. Anyway, back to the story, because that's what it's all about. The stories. Mr. Twit Gets a Horrid Shock. Mr. Twit, who thought he had seen his ugly wife for the last time, was sitting in the garden celebrating with a mug of beer. Silently, Mrs. Twit came floating down. When she was about the height of the house above Mr. Twit, she suddenly called out at the top of her voice,
"Here I come, you grisly old grunion! You rotten old turnip! You filthy old frumpet!"
Mr. Twit jumped as though he had been stung by a giant wasp. He dropped his beer. He looked up. He gasped. He gaped. He gurgled. A few choking sounds came from his mouth. He said, ouch!
"I'll get you for this!"
shouted Mrs. Twit. She was floating down right on top of him. She was purple with rage and slashing the air with a long walking stick, which she had somehow managed to hang on to all this time.
"I'll swish you, you swazzle!"
she shouted.
"I'll swash you, you swizzle! I'll nash you, you nozzle! I'll nosh you, you nuzzle!"
And before Mr. Twit had time to run away, this bundle of balloons and petticoats and fiery fury landed right on top of him, lashing out with the stick and cracking him all over his body. And that's the end of part 13 of the Twits. Mr. Twit Gets a Horrid Shock. Here on the Lights Out podcast, bedtime stories for boys and girls around the world. Good night.